AskReddit. Redditors whose father, grandfather or great-grandfather fought in World War II. What is their most interesting war story they told you?
Strength. Hasty to help me.
My step-grandfather spent some time in North Africa and was in Normandy. He was part of a crew on a half-track. They saw a lot of action. They used Molotov cocktails against tanks. Because they didn't have much firepower to knock them out, they would throw the Molotov cocktail on the tank and catch it on fire, then shoot the crew. When they tried to escape, they caught a bunch of Germans in a staff car and took them out. Another time a sniper was shooting from a brick building. Their bullets weren't having much effect, and so they just rammed the building to eliminate him. His tour came to an end when they were engaged by a 88 cannon in France during the breakout from Normandy. They had seen them in North Africa and knew that they were very accurate. They would first fire 2 shots. One to get the range, another to get the angle, left/right. The third shot would be dead on. So they saw the first 2 shots and knew that they would not make cover before the third. So they stopped the half track. 4 of the guys took cover under the half track. He dove into the ditch. The 4 guys under the half track died. He woke up a week later, naked, in a hospital in England. My uncle was a partisan in France. He was very feminine in appearance and personality. He infiltrated a Nazi military base dressed as a woman and said he was there to see the officer in charge of the base. You know, because they thought he was a girl, they let him in without much thought, and he ended up stabbing the officer and escaped. My uncle dressed in drag and stabbed a Nazi. No, this is not a joke. What's more interesting is what they didn't say. On the 4th of July, we were never allowed to have fireworks at my cousin's farm. We'd hang out all day and we didn't go into town for anything. My cousins had never even been to a parade. This was in a place and time where everyone had firecrackers. Because my uncle, who had served in the South Pacific, couldn't be around fireworks. If he heard a bang, including a car backfiring, he hit the deck before he even knew he'd heard a noise. It wasn't slow like a tree falling. It was more like he was instantly down flat, almost pressed down to get under the dirt. He also came back with his hair pure white and an understanding of basic Japanese. My dad, all my uncles, everyone had served in World War II, but he was the one left with this reflex. I asked my mom about it. Me, about age 9. Wow, I guess that's how he stayed alive. My mom, oh, no, he was never anywhere near combat. They teach them that in basic training. Me, how do you know he never was in combat? My mom, he told us in his letters. He was never in danger. Me, she is now 90 and she still believes her brother was never in combat. He didn't fight, but my grandpa was a child in Germany at the time. One of my favorite stories from his is at the end of the war, US troops were heading past his family's farm. Some of the group broke off and came to the house. They didn't speak German, and none of his family spoke English. Eventually they figured out the troops wanted milk. They handed over a decent amount, and the troops took it back to the rest of the group. They kind of stood around with it for a bit, and eventually brought whatever it was in back to the house, and started passing drinks out. They took the milk to make chocolate milk for all the kids on the farm. I had an uncle who served in World War II, which everyone in my family kind of knew. But he never spoke about it. There were no pictures and no trinkets from his time in the military. His kids knew nothing about it, and even I, who spent a lot of time with him the last 15 years of his life, knew nothing. Never took VA benefits, never parked in veteran parking, nothing. Honestly, I admit I assumed he saw some nasty shit, or did something equally bad, which was hard to imagine, because he was the nicest honriest old man. It wasn't until his funeral, and we started going through pictures, that we discovered the truth. He was in the Naval Choir, and performed all over the US and Europe. He even took photos with the USO to show donations being used, a male freaking model. What a hell of a secret. This is the story my grandpa used to always tell me. He was from Pennsylvania, coal country, and had worked in the mines since he was probably 13 or 14, but enlisted in the army when he turned 16. Because that side of my family is Ruthenian, and he had uncles/other family who fought in the Austro-Hungarian forces during WWI. He by default got sent to the Pacific, according to him at least. No sure if the military actually checked that. Now in order to get to the Pacific from the east coast they had to take these huge ships that went around South America, I guess too big for the canal. And these ships obviously had to stop along the way. So the ship my grandpa was on stopped in Brazil, where he promptly bought a monkey and brought it with him. Unfortunately the story has a sad ending. A few weeks later there were some chewed up components on the ship. They blamed my grandpa's monkey and shot it. A week or two after that they discovered the ship had a bad rat infestation and that's what caused the damage. Not a relative of mine, but I met a man who stormed Omaha Beach and was a main advisor to Spielberg for Saving Private Ryan. He got shot in the face and several other places on his body by an ambushing machine gun. Interestingly, the little morphine shots they had Iral were slightly less than a lethal dose, so 2 of them would kill you. In the film, when they give the medic a second shot of morphine, it's the morphine that kills him. Edit, my first Reddit silver. Thanks. Wow, that gives the scene so much more context. When they look to Tom Hanks' character for permission to give him the second dose makes so much more sense, but also adds to an already powerfully emotional scene. When landing on D-Day he was the lowest ranking crewman in his tank, so they made him get out of the tank and fix something on the outside while getting shot at. He was outside his tank walking through a French village that had supposedly been cleared. It was mostly ruins. A German officer came out of the rubble, yelled some bullshit in German, and threw a grenade, except it hit a hanging telegraph wire, bounced back at him, and he blew himself up. They were scouting in Normandy, which involved going through hedgerows and looking if anyone was there, and then going to the next field. One time, someone was there, and his tank was hit at close range by an 80 gun. Grandpa crawled out of the tank and tried to run for it, but was shot in the leg. The Germans tied him up and left him in a chicken coop, then they ran away. He was found by some British troops the next day. He was patched up in a field hospital and assigned to a new tank. He was on R&R and saw a Gurkha kill an American soldier who was drunk and tried to fight the Gurkha. The next day all the soldiers on leave got yelled at by some high-ranking officer that they were not allowed to talk to the Gurkhas. My other grandfather was a RAF pilot, Spitfire. The only story I heard is he got shot down and took a taxi back to the airbase and was up in a new plane before the end of the day. I have his wings somewhere. My grandfather was in the Navy and was stationed on the USS Indianapolis. He was part of the group of soldiers that got off in Guam 2 days before the ship was sunk by the Japanese. He never really talked about it, as pretty much all of his friends in the Navy died on that day. Well, not a typical war story, but here it is. My dad was reported missing in action in the Battle of the Bulge. My grandfather had a nervous breakdown and went to Canada for a rest cure. Came back with a mistress, moved her into the family home with my grandmother and aunt. My dad was found relatively unharmed. The mistress stayed. No one talked about it. She became an unofficial aunt while I was growing up. I didn't figure it out until I was much older. Good times, eh? Long story, so my grandparents are both very old. They were young, but of age at the time of World War II. My grandfather is an American man and cold being the poster child for the typical all-American. He joined the army in World War II and was deployed in Europe. My grandmother was born and raised in southwestern Germany, lived in a beaten up town from bombings, but still had a house standing. My grandfather was off on a motorcycle trip through the countryside and stopped in my grandmother's town. He came to like her and continued to stop by. Later on, the war ended and he was sent back to America. My grandmother remained in Germany. The two mutually agreed to send letters back and forth. While my grandfather still remained in the army, all mail went through the mailroom. Well, they sent love letters for a while and his buddies in the mailroom saw them. After a long time of this, my grandmother had enough of my grandfather and sent him the go away letter. The buddies in the mailroom started editing the letters between the two. Once again, a long time passed and this continued to go on, and my grandfather went back to southwestern Germany to propose to my grandmother. He had a round trip ticket for himself and a one-way to the US. Needless to say, my grandmother was very surprised when he showed up. Things slowly unfolded, and she said yes. She packed up her belongings, which weren't much because of the war, and flew back to the US. The two married, had the buddies in the mailroom become groomsmen, and settled in a city. They have been married for over 60 years and still live in America today.